I want to start. Well, I was thinking a bit like Nelson this morning, and I thought I would put that image from Isaac's performance yesterday, just to accompany the reflections I want to share with you. And I hope it will make sense as we move in the conversation. Well, first I want to say thank you for the space and the conversation. Quiero empezar por agradecer el espacio y agradecer esta conversación. Especialmente estoy agradecido de estar aquí con quienes considero nuestros mayores en este grupo de pensamiento. Y pues, Walter, María, Katy, Arturo que salió, John, y quiero agradecerles su presencia porque creo que sin su caminar y su gratitud, lo que ellos nos han dado, nosotros no estaríamos aquí hablando. Ellos han abierto este espacio a través de su propio caminar y de compartirlo con nosotros. Bueno, de lo que quiero hablar, let me say in English, I was expressing my gratitude especially to be among the people that I consider are our elders in this school of thinking. And this is Walter, Katy, Maria, John, Arturo Escobar. And because I think that without their walking and without their generosity, we would not be all here talking today. I will start by speaking about the importance of thinking about relationality. We heard a lot about relationality this morning, and we have been hearing the word a lot of times. And I want just to put it in context and to see why it is important to speak of it today. Quiero empezar por decir por qué es importante hablar de relacionalidad hoy. I will quote Arturo Escobar in one of his texts where he's saying, today, in other words, we are witnessing a renewed attack on anything collective. Hoy estamos presenciando un ataque ante todo lo que es colectivo. Globalization, whatever it means, has taken place at the expense of relational worlds. La globalización, lo que quiera decir, cualquier sentido que tenga, dice Arturo Escobar, ha tomado lugar bajo el costo de los mundos relacionales. Entonces, la globalización del capital, la globalización neoliberal, ha significado la destrucción de los mundos relacionales. Y es por eso que es muy importante que pensemos qué es la relacionalidad y qué significa pensar a partir de la relacionalidad. So, the neoliberal world, economic globalization, has destroyed relational worlds. And that is why it is very important today to talk about what does relationality means. In my own perspective, this is one of the biggest definitions of modernity. When we speak of modernity, coloniality, for me, modernity is that which has destroyed the possibility of relationality. Estoy diciendo que desde mi perspectiva, la modernidad es aquello que ha destruido la posibilidad de la relacionalidad. El proyecto moderno colonial ha sido un continuo de desarticulación de las formas relacionales de existencia. So the modern colonial project, since its beginning, since the colonial encounter and slavery, is a project that has been destroying systematically the forms of relationality. And if that is the context in which I would like to speak, I don't have much time, but I would like to keep it to the 10 minutes, so I might not be able to cover all the subjects, but I would like to speak about subjectivity, about temporality. All these are topics that came out yesterday and today. So subjectivity, temporality, representation, and listening. Voy a hablar de 4 temas. dentro del contexto de entender la modernidad como aquello que destruye la relacionalidad. El tema de la subjetividad, de la temporalidad, de la representación y del escuchar, que son temas que yo he venido recolectando a partir de la plática de ayer y de esta mañana. Bueno, en la foto que tenemos del trabajo de Isaac, para mí este momento o esta imagen que se produjo es un momento que me habla del dejar la subjetividad moderna. For me, this image and this moment is an image that talks to us about the possibility of leaving behind modern subjectivity. It is, as I saw it, or this is the word that came into my mind when I was there, it is about the return. It is under the sign of the return. Está bajo el signo del retorno. Pero no es un retorno al pasado moderno, sino es un retorno a lo que uno es. It is a return towards what one really is. So it is the return as resistance. And this is really, that's why I would like to speak about temporality, if I have time. This is really understanding, this is understanding the question of time in a different way, when you really can understand that the return is the resistance. Because for the modern projects, resistance or liberation is always futuric, it's always under the sign of the future. For, I think for the DECOLONIALITY project, liberation is under the sign of the return. Entonces digo que la modernidad, dentro de la modernidad, la liberación se entiende siempre bajo el signo del futuro. Y quiero reflexionar con esta imagen acerca de la liberación o la resistencia bajo el signo del retorno, del volver. Y ahí es donde se habla de la esperanza del volver a ser, siempre con el pasado enfrente. El volver a ser porque el pasado está enfrente, por la certeza de lo sufrido, por la certeza de la dominación. Es donde está la esperanza de volver a ser. No se trata de inventar un nuevo ser en el futuro, una utopía. La modernidad se ha cargado de utopías que han sido el signo de la violencia, destruir todo lo que no cabe en la utopía del futuro. So I'm saying that this return, this sign of return is the return to be someone, but someone that is multiple, as I will explain. Always with the past in front. Always, this past in front is very important because el pasado en frente es muy importante porque it gives us the positionality. Somebody that has the past in front is always positioned, knows who she is. It's on the ground. It's not dreaming of a future, it's not an abstract subjectivity. La modernidad genera una subjetividad abstracta, siempre basada en un modelo de futuro. Y yo creo que esta resistencia con el pasado enfrente es una resistencia siempre posicional, porque se conoce en su pasado. Y este reconocimiento es una desnudez, es un partir de la vulnerabilidad, reconocer la vulnerabilidad del ser humano, que siempre está en relación y que existe en relación. So it is a recognition of vulnerability to proceed in this way. And it is only from this vulnerability that I see the possibility of a truly intercultural dialogue. Solo cuando conocemos nuestra vulnerabilidad y nuestra posicionalidad podemos entrar en un diálogo intercultural, porque podemos reconocer al otro. Si no, solo nos vemos a nosotros mismos. Otherwise, we only look at ourselves when we are not positioned. So in the dialogues with Maria, some beautiful dialogues we are having, this undressing that was in the image disappeared. This undressing, I also saw it as the undressing of the normative masculinity. Es desvestirse de la masculinidad normativa. And this normative masculinity is, as I have come to think it with Maria, is an abstraction that blinds us and that encloses us. So la normatividad masculina, este desvestirse, digo, es un desvestirse de la normatividad de la masculinidad. Y es esa masculinidad la que se vuelve una abstracción. Es la abstracción del sujeto moderno que encarnamos a través de la masculinidad y que nos encierra. It encloses us in the model of the abstract subject, of the individualized subject, the subject that is incapable of relation. Nos encierra en una subjetividad aislada, abstracta, que es incapaz de relación. It's capable of commerce and power, it is not capable of relation. It is functional to the structures, it is made in the image of the structures. Está hecha en la imagen de las estructuras del poder, del comercio, de las instituciones, de las academias. Es un sujeto individualizado, pero no es un sujeto incapaz de relación. Okay, I think I'm running completely out of time, but I would like to say a couple of more things. Anyway, let's see. I will take just 2 more minutes. Okay. I wanted to speak of relational temporalities. And so that's what I call relational temporalities. When we are speaking of time, for me there is a very big misunderstanding of the question of time and its separation from space. Most people will separate chronological time or linear time from cyclical time or circular time. And both are modern imaginations, modern geometrical imaginations of time. But that's a simple way. I'm denying linear time, let's speak of circular time, right? Or triangular or something. The typically circular or cyclical or something like that. What I want to suggest is not to speak of linear, to move from linear chronological time to relational temporalities. And this is also something that is coming, for instance, in the work of Dalida when she was showing the archive of the body, when Brittany was speaking about the body and memory, and the faculty that the body has of memory, of inhabiting memory. That inhabitation of memory is not something in space, it's something in time. It's something relational. The body is relating to time. It's relating to the memorial. And this is what we present in most of the artists' performances yesterday, which was this also in Jeff's work, which was this invocation that the body is capable of. Estoy diciendo que el cuerpo y la facultad que tiene el cuerpo de habitar la memoria es lo que nos habla de un tiempo relacional. Un cuerpo que es capaz de invocar, que es capaz de vivir una memoria que va más allá de la memoria individual. Y esa es la temporalidad relacional, que no es circular o lineal, es una temporalidad relacional. También cuando hablábamos de que la tierra es memoria, the land is memory, we said yesterday several times, and that's a very common knowledge in all indigenous philosophies. Land is memory. And that shows that that separation between time and space is just a modern invention. Yeah? So when we are saying, and what Jolene shows about James Luna's work, where the body as the absence of the land, is precisely signifying that connection with with time, where the land is memory, where the body is memory. And that's why the body can be the absence of land, because it is remembering. We live through remembrance, we speak through remembrance. Solo hablamos a través del recuerdo, si no, no podríamos hablar. Y por eso tenemos el pasado enfrente. Tenemos nuestro lenguaje enfrente, sino cómo hablamos. ¿No? So finally, to close, I will leave the two next chapters for next talk. I will just speak a little bit about relationality in terms of how I understand this destruction that modern decoloniality has done to the relational world. Voy a hablar un poquito de la relacionalidad y de cómo la modernidad colonialidad ha destruido las posibilidades de relación. Entonces yo veo tres dimensiones. I propose 3 dimensions of this relationality. One is the dimension of ourselves, the relation to ourselves. I'm not saying the relation to myself, I'm saying the relation to ourselves. La primera dimensión es la dimensión de la relación con el nosotros mismos, no el yo mismo, sino el nosotros mismos. Siempre una interioridad plural, una interioridad relacional. Already an interiority that is plural and relational. La relación al otro, a los otros, a la comunidad, a los otros seres humanos. The relation to the other, or the others, the other human beings, which is an important relation of the ethical and the political. Y la relación con el cosmos, con lo no humano, and the relation with the cosmos, or the cosmological, or the non-human, that is beyond the human. And what I want to suggest as a closing remark is that, in my view, modernity cuts all those relationalities by fragmenting existence and the experience of existence. And in my view, only through a relationality to a plural interiority to ourselves, we can understand our relation to the cosmological, the beyond the human. So if we are to recover our relationality, we need to think of a thinking that has to move beyond the anthropocentric. Es un pensamiento, el pensamiento de la relacionalidad, es un pensamiento que llama a un pensamiento post-antropocéntrico, donde el hombre, como nos mostraron el pensamiento aymara, no es el centro del universo y de todo el pensamiento, donde el hombre tiene que humillarse, hacerse humilde y encontrar cómo está constituido por esas relaciones. Entonces, para mí, la relacionalidad implica una relacionalidad hacia el interior, que también se ha perdido en la modernidad, la conexión hacia el interior, porque vivimos siempre hacia el exterior. Y es solo a través de esa relacionalidad al interior múltiple donde encontramos la conexión con comunidad y con lo no humano, con lo más allá de lo humano o lo cosmológico. So when we are thinking of relationality, I think we cannot just speak about it lightly or put it as an adjective. We really need to understand that it implies to think really in a very different way, in a post-anthropocentrical way. And that this might enable the possibility of opening really colonial intercultural dialogues with other philosophies, with the non-Western philosophies that are still alive. Entonces, para cerrar, estoy diciendo que cuando hablamos de relacionalidad, no solo tenemos que usar la relacionalidad como un adjetivo, o porque está de moda o algo así, sino que tenemos que entender la implicación de pensar relacionalmente. ¿No? Acá estamos escuchando mucho relacionalidad, pero sin un pensamiento relacional. Entonces, pensar relacionalmente implica ir más allá del antropocéntrico y también abre la posibilidad de un diálogo decolonial intercultural con las otras filosofías que no son antropocéntricas. Gracias.
Okay, so we have about 45 minutes for conversation. Anybody want to go first?
I want to follow up a little bit, and I have questions for Rolando.
Okay, first, anybody else want to go after Rolando?
Diane,
Four. Five. También? No? Okay, first round.
yeah, I really would like to really maybe clarify or maybe somehow become more transparent about, because you have mentioned a neology about the coloniality coming from certain people, and and you're talking about how to relate to relationality in a decolonial way. But what you have brought out, there are many people who think that way, and not have come to that, to the coloniality. And this needs to be clear, because indigenous people, they don't use, and they have not come or arrived the way you're presenting to this whole issue, and not necessarily they have taken the road to, or the decolonial road that you have presented to arrive there. So that needs to be, so decoloniality won't colonize the experience of people who have already for years, because the Afro-Caribbeans and indigenous people have, that's their way to experience time and relationality, So this needs to be clear, because there are certain people who talk about relationality and they come from the decolonial way, but that's not necessarily, I don't know. Yo lo que quiero es ser un poco transparente, porque Rolando ha planteado una historia de colonialidad que viene de los que han mencionado, Walter, María, aparentemente que ha llegado él a entender eso y la relacionalidad a través de la decolonialidad, y yo he planteado que tanto los indígenas como los afrodescendientes, la manera que experimentamos o sentimos el tiempo y la relacionalidad es algo que está con nosotros y que necesariamente no hemos llegado a través de la colonialidad a eso, porque eso es una experiencia ancestral nuestra. Y que quiero que esté eso claro, que la decolonialidad, que hay quienes a través de la decolonialidad han llegado a eso. Y no quiero que la decolonialidad colonice los pensamientos indígenas y afrodescendientes.
Yeah, my questions actually are kind of like bringing together two questions that I think Miriam and Isaac brought forth, and it's definitely connected to what Rolando was saying. And they're false or like provocational equivalences, or troubled equivalences, and it's Miriam presented does tribal equal indigenous, right? I don't think that's a resolved matter. And for Isaac it was, does indigenous equal decolonial? Isaac answered quite clearly, no. Indigenous does not equal decolonial. That's how he started, right? I think Miriam also, in the provocation part at the end, I think problematized the equivalency of tribe. At the very least, she presented an example in the Middle East where the tribal is actually used contrary to many of the things we've been hearing in the last 2 days. It's certainly used for corporate profit, it's used for globalization, it's used for capitalism, it's used for many of these things, right? So my question is, can we have the cake and eat it? And I mean it. It's not a critical. It's like how there is, of course, many utopian projects within modernity have had this notion that whatever you want, you state it, and then you give it the label of what you're working for, right? So this is a cautionary thing, right, with the decolonial project, but also with art projects and with indigenous projects. We know what we want often, we call it, and then we attach it to our project. But I think, especially after this presentation, I think we should embrace the contradictions and really confront them. Because in this provocation of the tribal and the indigenous not actually default being decolonial, there's so much important stuff to think through, right? To work through in our experience, in our mind, and so on. Voy a traducir y digo, tal vez, I'm saying, perhaps we can have the cake and eat it. I don't think we should assume that you can. Entonces, hay que mantener la mente abierta y el estómago también. So, voy a traducir al español. Estoy como que juntando dos preguntas, una de Miriam y una de Isaac, y también con algunas de las cosas que presentó Rolando. La equivalencia que presentó, problematizada, que presentó Miriam, es lo tribal. ¿Es equivalente realmente a lo indígena? Y en la parte más de provocaciones al final de su presentación, me mostró muchos ejemplos en los cuales la forma en que se entiende lo tribal en el Medio Oriente es muy en contra de cómo estamos hablando de lo indígena aquí. Es corporativo, capitalista, de pureza racial, toda esta cosa que desde aquí, todos estamos aquí, vamos a encontrar esto, ¿no? Entonces está esa contradicción. Luego Isaac comentó con una equivalencia que negó definitivamente, que ¿es ser indígena ser decolonial? No, definitivamente no. Entonces, mi pregunta, hay una expresión, no sé cómo se dice en español, de hecho, can we have the cake and eat it? ¿Cómo se dice eso en español? Cuando uno quiere...
Las queremos todas.
Horneas el pastel y te lo puedes comer.
O sea, es como querer comer el pastel. Todos conocen la expresión. Es una expresión muy hermosa. Es cuando quieres ver el pastel y tenerlo junto y mantenerlo ahí como objeto, pero también quieres comértelo. Y quieres tener las dos cosas. Quieres poder comerlo y tenerlo como objeto. O sea, o tienes la experiencia o la fetichizas, ¿no? Es como... Entonces... esa expresión se usa para decir, no puedes tener tienes que escoger o la una o la otra. Yo no estoy diciendo que tengamos que escoger, simplemente hay que entender que es una contradicción y luego tal vez decir, tal vez sí este es un sistema de pensar paradójico, contradictorio, etcétera, pero vamos a enfrentarlo como tal y entonces vamos a decir, sí, we want the cake and we want to eat it, you know, but how do we do so, you know? Pero sí hay uno de los peligros es no enfrentar las contradicciones, ¿no? O sea, pretender que lo tribal es igual que lo indígena, o pretender que lo indígena, que ser indígena es default ser decolonial. En cuanto a la cuestión de tribal, claro que Walter ha escrito muchas cosas sobre la desoccidentalización, ¿no? Diferenciando el proyecto decolonial con la desoccidentalización, y creo que muchos de esos escritos clarifican esa parte paradoja. Pero como que es una invitación que me encantaría escuchar más de todos los que están aquí, cómo piensan esto.
Diane.
Okay. Sorry, that just made my idea much less interesting. But I guess maybe following on Pedro's suggestion and these incredibly rich talks coming on top of all the wonderful stuff we've been thinking about, it's maybe the way you were bringing up abstraction as this very complicated thing, right? And I'm thinking about it vis-a-vis Jolene's talk yesterday, in which, if I understood correctly, you were not suggesting there was some deeply lived reality that wasn't abstract, right? That when you were showing those pre-colonial images that were deeply abstract, and were these, incredibly powerful ways of thinking. And so I think we're trying to push beyond those kinds of those false binaries, right? That there is this thing called indigeneity that is fully relational and sort of not abstract in this and we all know the story of sort of the modern as that which abstracts, the capitalist is that which abstracts and extracts, right? But how to sort of think those in really complicated ways together, I think is still very much on the table. And maybe that's kind of what you're the cake is the idea of this thing, and yet the ethnographic of the practice, right, of the lived, how things are lived, which is why I think Isaac's, both the performance and his, what he spoke about just now, of what happens when you go back into actual use of words, into actual use of clothing, into actual practices of, embroidering, etc. And at particular moments in time, right? Maybe children before they're 4 aren't gendered, but teenagers are definitely gendered, and sort of what happens as time moves, right? To keep that going with, I think, Rolando's point. So I don't know if this is a question or more of a point, but lo que quería hacer es platicar un poco, tal vez saliendo de esta metáfora del pastel, yo también tengo hambre para una merienda, de la cuestión de la abstracción, ¿verdad? ¿Qué significa intentar tal vez crear un binario falso entre lo que es lo indígena, lo relacional, y no sé si este sea cierto, es lo que querías hacer, y algo como el abstracto, como algo que hace la modernidad, o hace el colonialismo, o hace el capitalismo, ¿verdad? De abstraer y después extraer como el proceso de la colonización. Y cómo pensamos las ideas, los conceptos, con la práctica tan fuerte que nos ha ayudado a entender Isaac, no solamente con su performance, pero también con su práctica de qué es la práctica, qué es en la vida diaria, el uso de las palabras, el uso de las prácticas como bordar o vestirse, que funciona ahí como una abstracción o no. O sea, no quiero verlo como algo totalmente distinto, pero cómo lo pensamos totalmente juntos, y también cómo se va desenlazándose por el tiempo, ¿verdad? Porque no el tiempo cíclico, tampoco teleológico, como la flecha que va hacia allá, pero también como algo que cambia. Nosotros cambiamos dentro de este tiempo. No sé si me explico.
Yes, and I skipped over Professor Mignolo and then.
Professor Mignolo.
Y después Miguel, you want to go to
Yeah, a quick question and then a couple of comments. Miriam, a good question is when you answer, please remember to clarify for me why before 1971 there is no Qatar or Qatari. You said something. No, my comments were, thank you for bringing that, because the invitation to Miriam was a kind of perverse invitation to bring precisely the tribal into the conversation of indigeneity. And I think that the question is what Pedro was saying. I will say that indigeneity and the tribal are similar, are the two different names for what we mean by indigeneity. The question is precisely that indigeneity is controlling the state and controlling the economy, and as you say, branding the nation. So branding the nation means to take one of the myths of modernity, which is a community of birth, nationality, but is modern but non-Western. You said that twice. And I think that this is the Westernization. Is capitalist, is exploitative, have all the vices of capitalism, but at the same time, is modern if you want. I mean, isn't national, isn't nation state, but it's non-Western. And that is precisely the Westernization. So the point here is that decolonization, as I said it yesterday, I repeat now, I cannot think decolonization in the hand of the state. The state cannot regulate decolonization, and that's why who are the actors and the institution of decolonization? The actor is the emerging global political society. What do I mean by that? I think that two phenomena that we are witnessing now is the politicization of the civil society. Civil society was always civilized. Why? Now, cannot be longer civilized because neoliberals squish the indignados, squish the intifadas, squish Ghazi Park, squish Maidan. So everybody, for different reasons, there are different local history, but the politicization of the civil society doesn't have a project and doesn't have to have it, and that's important. Because Zizek complained that the civil society doesn't have a project. It is true, but doesn't have to have it. Because, I mean, the civil society, they come from different walk of. But what's important in the civil society is kind of saying enough. And then is the moment in the moment in which the political society emerges. And the political society is just all those kind of projects we have, and we can call decolonization at large. Not that they are thinking modernity, coloniality as we do, but the kind of decolonization because they're kind of the linking from a kind of a structure of governance linked to capitalism. So I think it's important here to kind of distinguish tribal, modern, de-Westernizing, The question of decoloniality, that is not in the hand of the state or the even less the corporation. And yeah, I think it's important to underline that. I mean, to be black is not to be revolutionary. Not every black is man to be Obama. Right? I mean, that is very, very important that we identify certain, and to be white doesn't mean that you are corporate or kind of reactionary. I mean, you can be white and so that is the question of representation. Because something I heard when I talk about this kind of thing is that, but you know, those indigenous, they don't represent all the indigenous. Of course not. But there are projects that come from that kind of tribal, indigenous part. So those are my 2 comments.
I want to begin by making a distinction to you. Yeah. I think in Jolene's case, abstract means different from representationally literal. In your case, it means not removed. Removed, it means not removed. So where you're going is for not removed. And those, in my mind, are extraordinarily different things. Okay, so I also want to say that, I mean, the colonialism happened. You know, it isn't as if people, you know, have kept, you know, their ways, because that isn't true. You know, and in my case, since I work on the animalization of indigenous and the Afro-descendant peoples, I think that keeping any sense of humanity has been difficult, and keeping it has also been blurred and has been, you know, in all of its resistance, it has taken up, you know, things that are in need of resistance. You know, and I think in your case, Isaac, I think you're taking up from within, you know, your situation, certain possibilities, right? So in a situation culturally where the distinction between men and women is not, you know, not there, right? Then you are taking up that possibility of, you know, speaking a woman's voice. You know, and that seems to me not something that is always given, you know, but it's something that you're taking up, right? And so it seems to me that something that we haven't done in this group really ever is to talk about masculinities. You know, so I'm very happy that, you know, we are beginning to talk about masculinities, and certainly masculinities is necessary in the plural, including colonial masculinities, black masculinities of many different places, and and masculinities as one way of problematizing modernity coloniality, you know, a way in which we haven't done it, you know, and I think a way that needs not to be removed, right, not to be abstract, because we do have a tendency for abstraction here, you know, so.
What do you mean by problematize modernity colonialism and masculinity?
What I mean is, as I agree with Rolando, that the masculinity is a construction, you know, as he's seen, one important modern colonial construction. Yes. So as we are constantly, it's our business, yes, to take up modernity coloniality and, you know, problematize it, you know, work against it, you know, think it through. That masculinity, thinking together about masculinity, you know, in a embodied, you know, personal and so on way is an important thing for us to do. Yes. I also want to say, together with this question of, coloniality is here. It isn't as if, we have remained pure. So I think that it is important for us to think with Rolando that our communal selves are in a sorry state. Or I think all of us, so that the possibility of our imagining community, and I don't mean in community, yes, it's a very, very difficult thing, wherever it is that we're situated. Sí, tengo que decirlo ahora en español. Sí. Bueno, lo que estoy diciendo son varias cosas. Una, quiere hacer una distinción entre abstracto, en el sentido en que lo usó Jolene, y abstracto en el sentido en que lo usó Rolando. Como lo usó Jolene, quiere decir no representacionalmente literal. Y como lo usó Rolando, quiere decir no distante. Y también quiero decir que no creo que estamos hablando solamente desde el punto de colonial que está colonizando a las gentes colonizadas. Cuando estamos hablando como está hablando Rolando de relacionalidades, porque la colonia pasó, sigue estando con nosotros, ¿no? Y esos, cómo la colonia está con nosotros, por ejemplo, en términos de las cuestiones de masculinidad, es algo importante, ¿no? Así que cuando tú, Isaac, estás tomando la cuestión de tomar la voz de una mujer, estás tomando algo que en tu cultura no hace una distinción, ¿no? Pero no es algo como si tú dijeras, lo hacemos todos, lo estás haciendo tú como un acto importante. Y también quiero decir que aquí no hemos hablado de masculinidades, y es algo que Rolando está iniciando, y que hablar de masculinidades en un sentido precisamente no abstracto, pero como la abstracción de la masculinidad ha sido una forma de la modernidad. Y después una cosita es que para todos nosotros, nuestros yoes comunales están en muy mal estado. Y que no importa dónde estemos, que necesitamos una salud en ese aspecto.
I want to start just thinking a little bit about if we can imagine other scenarios, right, and trying to go a little bit beyond the westernization. What happens when the project reaches a moment of liberation and brings us power or empowerment, right? What happens when we can build a museum for ourselves to represent ourselves? What would happen if we can get control over the nation, or the territories in which we are, get the autonomy we have? What would happen when we can have control over the resources and the money and the capital to inscribe our histories into the mainstream? And that's what Miriam is talking about. That's a very, very interesting, weird scenario, right? We are writing over energy resources. We are all using energy resources, right? And we're paying them for those. And they are building their own really modern, corporate, neoliberal. They are buying their space in history. They're building the collections, they are building the archives, they are buying the universities, they are franchising and buying universities, they are buying and bringing people like you guys there to look at and talk about it. Right? That's the scenario, is another provocation. What if? And then we have, of course, in our own territories, those visions, right? We have the victory of the mass and the indigenous movement, the cocaleros in Bolivia, and that's weird, it's left, of course, left, right, whatever. We have our bizarre examples. But it's just to think about it. Because when you talk about the political society, as Chakravarti puts it also, it's not the civil society, it's those who doesn't have anything else to lose. And when they push, they can get there. What will happen? This is an scenario. Right? This is a scenario. Like weird. Right? Right? Ya voy a saltar this one. Then it's a provocation. Right? What if? And Miriam said something about we have to rethink race again, the modern, but we have to think the modern, we have to think race. We have to think this issues really well within these configurations. Because they are a little bit different of the things that we are dealing with. I mean, they are dealing with genomics, they are dealing with blood counts, they're dealing with other kinds of colorings. Right? Commonality is lost in power. Right? We can be all about solidarity, but we get in power and this commonality disappears. We have an open wound there, and we have to work about it, as María says. En español, tenemos que pensar otros escenarios, y Miriam trabaja en un escenario que es bien particular, es el escenario en el que qué pasaría si tenemos el capital, si tenemos el poder, si tenemos la capacidad de construir nuestros museos, de comprar las historias, de construir nuestras universidades, de inscribir nuestras historias en esa metahistoria. ¿Qué pasaría si tuviéramos esa posibilidad? Y aquí vemos unos ejemplos de cómo está sucediendo, ¿cierto? Es simplemente una provocación para pensar estos dos escenarios. Una cosa es la desoccidentalización, pero ¿qué pasaría cuando este movimiento de la sociedad política, que no es la misma sociedad civil, la sociedad civil política como la pone Chakravarti, es esos que no tienen nada que perder, como los indignados, un poquito lo que pasó aquí con el Occupy, un poquito. No hay nada más que perder, pero ¿qué tal si se empuja tan fuerte que se llega al proyecto, que se logra tomar el poder? Entonces, ¿qué pasa si los tomamos? Ese es el escenario.
Pero esa no es la sociedad política.
Pero esa no es
la sociedad
Could I
política
say
colonial.
that this discussion is taking over?
So we'll continue with Ivan, Jolene, we'll return to the panelists, and if we have a bit more time, Claudia.
Solamente algo muy breve, pensando con Rolando el tema de la relacionalidad. Rolando, tú estás diciendo que la modernidad destruye la relacionalidad, y yo creo que lo que hace la modernidad es ocultar la relacionalidad. Yo creo que la relacionalidad ha estado presente, y asumir que la relacionalidad está destruida por el proyecto moderno es asumir que la modernidad is an all-encompassing force. Lo que estamos diciendo precisamente es que la modernidad surge también en la colonialidad, y la colonialidad también hay visiones existentes de la relación. Entonces decir que la modernidad tiene tanta fuerza como para destruir. Yo creo que lo que hace la modernidad es ocultar cierta forma en que la relacionalidad se ha vivido en los pueblos de Avia Yala, pero no creo que la esté destruyendo. Está ocultando ese tipo de relacionalidad. Entonces, digamos, un elemento como para activar un poco ese argumento interesante que nos estás compartiendo. El otro elemento que yo quería mencionar es que si la relacionalidad nos está invitando a ir más allá del antropocentrismo, yo creo que hay el riesgo, la alternativa no sería caer en un biocentrismo tampoco o en un ecocentrismo, sino ir más allá de los centrismos. O sea, lo que quiero decir es que la alternativa no es descentrar al humano para después recentrar al no humano, porque yo creo que eso está en contradicción con las luchas de los pueblos también y estamos pensando desde ahí. Recuerdo una visita a un trabajo en una comunidad donde planteamos este tema en el Amazonas, y la pregunta, bueno, pero la naturaleza y todas esas políticas de conservación, ¿cómo es que ustedes no cuidan los pajaritos? No, es que aquí los pajaritos no nos importan, aquí la gente se está muriendo de hambre. Entonces, un poco pensar que precisamente si nos tomamos en serio la relacionalidad, lo que hay que hacer es eliminar la figura del centrismo cualquiera que este sea. Entonces, beyond anthropocentrism, in my view. Vamos a hablar en inglés. So what I was thinking is that I don't believe I want to trouble the idea that Rolando is sharing us about that modernity, the fact that modernity is destroying relationality. I want to propose instead that modernity is attacking or hiding certain ways in which relationality has already existed throughout throughout time. So that's the first point, and if taking seriously anthropocentrism shouldn't take us to another centrism, which is biocentrism or ecocentrism. I think we have to go beyond any type of centrism if you want to take seriously the idea of relation. And I'm particularly thinking about communities in the south, in the Amazonas, where they don't care too much about preserving the birds, conserving any part of conservation when people are dying of hunger. So I think the relation between humans and non-humans are beyond any centrism that I think we need to understand this idea of relation.
Yes, I'd like to perhaps bring out a couple things that I think are caught up in different situatedness, in that I'm coming from a different set of experiences than most of you are coming from, and that this is not often brought out in this conversation, and I think that it needs to be. So I think there's a difference between the project of indigeneity and indigenous, and that the broader set of instructions or ideas around indigeneity is a set of circumstances that are always in dialogue with colonial oppression, and that it's a response to it, where the anthropological, the notion of indigenous is very much anchored in biology and anthropology, and it's still a circumstance of the West, but in fact begins to deal with a very specific indication of place. And so in this discussion, I feel that I feel that the theory is not serving the very important discussion of place, because part of the discourse of both indigeneity and indigenous is always, for us, a relationship to place. And if we let go of that, then we let go of a central strategy of our existence. And so another thing I'd like to just bring up is that, and maybe this is another different question of situatedness, but the word tribal in North America is pejorative, it's anchored in primitivism, it's anchored in subjugate space as within a federal or state system. And so for those indigenous peoples in North America that continue to construct themselves along tribalism, they in a sense are undermining their own autonomy. And so the effort to separate yourself from that framing, which is that you are constructed as a ward within the federal government, is part of the discourse of tribalism. And so I'm not sure how that works out in Latin America or in other parts of the hemisphere, but that is, I think, a tension that's very important to bring out from my perspective. Then the other thing I wanted to respond to is the idea that Miriam brings forward, that which is something that I was talking about yesterday, with this idea of what if we weren't interrupted? So here we have a group of people that the suggestion is that they're not interrupted, but it's my understanding that the Saudis prevailed because of British intervention in that region, and that the Saudis actually have surfaced in a way that is part of a broader colonial apparatus. And so the notion that they're pristine or have not been, interrupted, I don't think is what you're suggesting. Not at all, okay.
Not at all.
Okay, and so this idea that anywhere in the world that there's indigenous peoples that have been able to somehow come into modernity without being able to be completely self-determined, I think has not, we have no evidence of that today. But what people, I think that this pressure that any people in the world is autonomous and self-determined needs to be questioned. Because all peoples of the world, all governments, all cultures of the world have in some way been changed by all different kinds of contact. And so I think one of the things that I try to think through is that as indigenous peoples, we've arrived in the 21st century with this incredible tome of knowledge that is relational, and that we've been able to maintain these structures because of our cultural frame, and that the stress to separate ourselves from that cultural frame and place is the project in some way of colonial modernity, and that we've resisted that and have come to this point of time with a very different, not a very different, but a prioritization of how to understand reality that is part of, I think, or not really central to this discussion. And I guess I just think that's what is in question. That's really what is at stake here. So that's.
De traducción un poco.
Oh, yes, okay.
Alright.
Collective translation, please. Okay. Jolene estaba diciendo que hay una diferencia entre indigenous o indígena y indigenidad. Y indígena está más, how do you say, rooted,
Asociado con la tierra.
Antropología,
Y colonialismo.
y colonialismo, antropología.
Y
Y que
la indigeneidad.
Es un proyecto político.
es
Sí.
un proyecto político.
No lo dijo, pero no lo dijo, pero
Y
podemos
que está
suponer.
relacionado
Todos lo
con
terminamos
la
en la
locación,
cabeza.
el
Pero no
espacio,
lo
el
dijo.
territorio, y que es una estrategia muy central la idea del territorio para el pensamiento de la indigeneidad.
Que acá lo que quiso hacer, marcar es una diferencia. Dijo que acá eso se estaba perdiendo de vista, que ella quería marcar esa diferencia. La diferencia de que cuando hablamos de lo indígena, hablamos de territorio, de asociación con la tierra, y que para ella
Espacio.
eso, con el espacio, con el
lugar.
espacio,
Con el lugar.
con el lugar, space, sí, con el lugar. Y que esa determinación, que eso determinaba los discursos. Ella sentía que había una sobredeterminación de los discursos, y que ella estaba hablando desde otro lugar.
También habló de la diferencia que lo del trivial, que lo tribal, que no se usa porque está asociado con el primitivismo, y es una de las políticas del Estado, y los que se enganchan en esa cuestión del de lo tribal, no están propensos a perder su poder de autonomía, ¿no? Y también habló un poco de preguntarse la cuestión de la interrupción, ¿no? Que hizo la colonialidad, ¿no? Que también ahí es algo importante traer
La pregunta era si el caso que estaba presentando Miriam era, como ella había hablado ayer, el hecho de una comunidad indígena no interrumpida. Si en realidad el caso de Miriam que estaba trayendo se trataba de eso. Ella planteaba que no, en la medida en que que en la medida en que los sauditas habían interrumpido esa comunidad, que había una intervención inglesa y que entonces ese territorio era un territorio también en disputa. De manera que ese no era el ejemplo que ella estaba planteando o que podía pensarse como un grupo o una comunidad indígena o una tribu, a pesar de lo peyorativo, que no era interrumpida.
Gracias.
¿Y cuál es el último punto? Pero
Sí,
pueden
a mí no
hacer.
me quedó claro ese
Sorry,
este no es
Elaborate on your last point.
the last point, pero en español, es decir,
No, I think
this is
Acá
not what is at
acá
the
no
stake
saben.
here, you were kind of saying. The last point you made, that you said this is not what at the stake here, and it kind of,
The program has 3 words in it: art, indigeneity, decolonialism. And so in the indigeneity category, I think that's been ill-defined here. And that it needs to be brought out more fully, because the project of indigeneity is very different than what is being discussed here. Our projects, and I think that there are glimmers of it, but it's not as fully developed as the art and the decolonial discussion is.
okay, can I add just, no, I mean, I think you're right, and but I think that this is what was an issue yesterday, and that's what I think Raúl was pointing out, that we are not making enough clear that when we talk about decoloniality and the colonial nature power, this is one project, and we didn't emphasize enough that there is another indigeneity project, is another decolonial project with a kind of different language,
Right,
a different
right.
memory, and the Afro in the American, different. There is another way.
Right.
So I think that.
Yeah, maybe
Well, I mean,
that's-
I think
yeah.
that Raúl's reaction was kind of made Raúl is very.
Right.
Exactly, but it's not that the modernity coloniality project is trying to colonize your memory. It's that we didn't make clear enough
Right.
that this is one project and this is the project of the people of European descent in South America.
Ah.
Right.
No, well, we should discuss this, Piñolo. Wait, clarification.
Okay.
Wait. I can make a statement.
If you need an excitement,
Okay, so let me, I think I'd like to sort of respond seriatim, but some of the responses will overlap. So Pedro, I'm glad you came back because then I can respond to you. So is it tribal indigenous? I think it is, because what was key, and maybe I didn't make enough of it is blood, or something like blood. And that's the crucial thing. And I think something like blood is connected to land. And it is connected to land because those who are on that land have won it over the centuries, millennially, they have won it. And in the process of winning it and making it theirs, they are allowing that possession of the land to create something like blood, even if it is entirely clear that this pure blood is as invented and mythologized as it was for the Spanish Inquisition. In terms of embracing contradiction, I didn't even talk about it, but what my project is all about, and one that I guess I throw out as another provocación, is the Barza. So it's way too complicated to go into, but it is a way that comes from the region. It's used in the Quran. That is a way of compelling one to stay with a contradiction and to make the contradiction productive, not as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but rather constantly as a process productive. So it comes in the Quran from in two places. One is to talk about this life, the next life, and then the thing in between. That is, and importantly not ever mixed. It is both and neither. Both and neither. It is, in the other place in the Quran, it's referred to as the place where sweet water and salt water are both there and neither is there. And it's not the brackish water of a river coming into the sea. It is the waters that come from the fossil aquifers in the Saudi Peninsula, in the Arabian Peninsula, that enter the Gulf around Bahrain. Bahrain in Arabic means two seas, and the seas are one on top of the other. There is a sweet water from the aquifers that is underneath. The salt water that is lighter is on top, and it has been millennially like that. That is the barzakh. That is something that sailors used to dive down into to collect that sweet water so that they could drink it while they were out at sea and never had access to land during the time that they were going for the pearls. Camels smell it. So you'll see a camel going deep into the water. You think that they're crazy, that they're drinking salt water, they're drinking sweet water. So that's embracing the contradiction. So there was, somebody said, what happens when you go back into actual practice? And that was something that I skimmed over, but that's precisely what is happening now. When you go back into actual practice, when you've got another practice, I think what you're doing is you're essentializing. And you're essentializing for a purpose. Objects of that to which you go back, whether the past is in front or behind you, become fetishized. And they then become, at least what I've seen, they become part of a racist identity. Because what makes you that special person is because you have these practices and because you have these things. Why no Qatar before 1971? Because the British were there and it was all the truthful states. And then when the British wanted to leave, everybody around there, particularly Dubai and Abu Dhabi, were, please, no, don't go because, we need you. And the British are no, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi compete to say, look, we'll pay for all of your military expenses, but just stay. And the British are like, no, we're finished. And they called 1971 independence. So, love your colonizer. I shocked Walter the other day. But what do we do with indigenous who love the colonizer? Sorry, I'm sounding terribly right-wing here, but I think it's an issue. I think it's something we have to think about. Why is it that the Algerians are going to Paris? Why are the Iraqis going to London? So what happens, you then get this new country, it's called Qatar, and then on Independence Day, which is something like December the 12th, We have articles about Qatar's deep millennial history. And it turns out that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, and his favorite wife Aisha, who lived in the 7th century, were wearing robes that had been woven by Qataris. Okay, yes, the state cannot regulate decolonization. Yet I guess this goes back to the whole question of what for? I mean, what are these projects for? So we have Malik Benabi, right, this Algerian philosopher, who calls for a jihad fikri, which is an intellectual struggle. And this is to decolonize oneself, right? Walt has written about that, so has other people that I know. So fine, you get this individual who's decolonized, but then there's a project, and the project has an agenda. And the agenda is to recognize others, it seems to me. And a term that I've not heard here is networking. And how do you network? You network when you have an agenda. Because then all sorts of unlikely people come together who recognize each other and recognize a commonality in their desire for something. For a buen vivir that you had talked about, or a new convivencia, if you're going to go back to Spain. So I think that yes, the state can't decolonize, but what happens to all of these decolonized individuals when they come together and they want to do something, and then you have to have somebody who's going to have some kind of leadership, and then we're into the hierarchy. Okay, then there was a question about masculinities and community. And so what we have in the Arab world are gender segregated communities. And within these gender segregated communities, we have very strong sense of relationality. So my question is the crisis that we've been talking about in relationality, is this a Western problem? Okay, then Jolene, to your point, I totally agree with you, this whole question of, theory for what? I mean, does it help the indigenous? So I've had a lot of discussion about the use of tribal. Many, particularly anthropologists, they tear their hair out. Oh my God, you can't use that term. It's so pejorative. So you've described how it's pejorative here. In Africa in particular, it is very, very pejorative. I spoke with Charlie Pio about it. And and Achille Mbembe, when he was here, I started talking about this, and he was so angry. How can you use the term? What's happened is that in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, and following on the quotation from the Comoros, we have the recuperation of this term. It becomes class. It becomes race. So I link race and class absolutely. The very first time I ever used the term tribal modern was when I went into a class of students in Doha. And I didn't dare use the term, but the person who'd invited me in, she said, no, I'd like you to see their reaction. So I said, does this make any sense? And they go, oh my God, of course tribal modern makes sense. And I said, well, how does it work? And the people actually said, what tribe are you from? So what's your name? What tribe? And then there's a whole recognition of tribal equivalence, because if you're not tribally equivalent, there now are new laws that determine tribal equivalence. And if a woman marries down, this is terribly problematic for the tribe. So I think we can recognize structures, and we can recognize that different names are attached to these structures, and maybe we need to think about that, and to understand that it is very upsetting for some people to be called by certain terms. That's it.
Una traducción
Hay que
que realmente
traducimos de forma va a ser breve. Bueno, Miriam dijo que en cuanto a la pregunta de lo de que si lo tribal es indígena o puede ser equivalente, ella dice definitivamente, ella piensa que sí, pero que ella no ve el problema con la contradicción. De hecho, en cuanto a bienvenir las contradicciones, un término del cual no pudo hablar, pero que estaba al final de su presentación, es el término del barzá, que es un término que a través de este mar de agua dulce y mar de agua salada, esta contradicción que existe en el Bahrein, ¿no? Los dos mares, es una experiencia física que ha dado a todo este tipo de construcciones culturales a través del barzá, que se trata de enfrentar la contradicción como algo latente, existente y que no se tiene que negar, ¿no? Luego, también en cuanto a la pregunta de Walter de por qué no hay Qatar antes del 71, ella explicó que antes de eso era territorio ocupado inglés, no existía tal cosa como Qatar, y ahí se da otra contradicción que es interesante en este contexto, que los indígenas de este territorio querían a los ingleses quedarse, les rogaban, pedían, quédense, nosotros les pagamos sus gastos militares, etc. Pero en el 71, en el acto de independencia, es cuando los ingleses se van, aunque había toda una demanda de que se quedaran. Entonces es una contradicción también que se puede decir acá. Y nada más voy a terminar con lo de Jolene, yo tuve que salir rápidamente, pero en cuanto a tribal, me imagino que hubo un momento de decir estos términos no se usa, o sea, se han usado de una forma muy negativa en la historia de Estados Unidos y en otros. Y la respuesta de Miriam es que ella está consciente de esto también en África, etc. Pero que en el Medio Oriente, en el área del Golfo, este es un término que ha resurgido. O sea, entonces ella está tratando de, por un lado, estar consciente de la historia de este término, de todo lo negativo que conlleva, pero también en esa región, cómo se está usando y de además cómo se usa, ¿no? Entonces,
que se asocia con clase.
Que se asocia con clase y raza, ¿no? Y que con sus alumnos, cuando ella ha tenido alumnos en Doha, ellos tienen discusiones enteras sobre este término de lo tribal y cómo se asocian ellos, quién baja, quién se ve como bajando de nivel por asociarse y casarse con otro tribu, etc., ¿no? Entonces sí es un término posible.
Gracias.
Únicamente quería apuntar un poco, bueno, acerca del que yo dije que lo indígena no era sinónimo a lo decolonial. Un poco haciendo el análisis del origen de los pueblos originarios, las naciones y los territorios, en el caso del mío, maya, originalmente se desarrollaban como pueblo maya, fue después con la colonización, y después por la colonización viene la decolonialidad. Entonces creo que el origen, y ahorita la palabra decolonial, siento que quizá lo decolonial se apoya de algunos rasgos o características propias de lo original, de los pueblos originarios, pero quizá no es lo sinónimo. Y también precisamente por lo colonial es que hay gente que incluso siendo indígena, hablando la misma lengua, llevando una vida aparentemente maya, el pensamiento es muy fuerte de lo colonial. Hay mucha gente que incluso escribe, hace cuentos, poesía y todo eso, pero está muy aferrado a la cuestión colonial. La cuestión de la palabra indígena, en el caso de la comunidad maya, la gente la palabra indígena, yo no digo tener indígena no existe. Se dice tener huatone, mayaon, somos mayas, y hay una estación de radio precisamente en mi comunidad, es del Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas, y estaba manejando la palabra macehual, que es una palabra náhuatl, para generalizar a todos los pueblos originarios, pero la gente no aceptó la palabra macehual. La gente decía, tenemos macehual, y yo no soy macehual. en ese caso como diccionario indígena maya, y también el decir más igual a no, o sea, las lenguas más iguales. Y se cambió incluso en la decisión, la gente dice mejor natsit ano, lenguas maternas. Entonces la cuestión en el caso de la palabra indígena, en el caso en el territorio maya no, como que no está asociado del todo, ¿no? Se dice maya on, maya en, maya natsit ano, en lenguas maternas, o en este caso la forma de vida original. Y en cuanto a lo de el tomar la voz de la mujer, todo en este caso, en el maya mismo, la lengua maya, viene como ya implícito el mensaje de la igualdad. Siempre, nunca alguien es más el otro, aunque incluso en la conducta cotidiana pueda ser diferente por la influencia de todo lo que ya sabemos. Pero en la lengua misma radica la cuestión de que nadie es más que el otro. Y un poco también es diferente al resto del país, a veces se generaliza, pero en cuanto a esa cuestión es equivalente. Me decía una persona en una presentación de un recital de poesía, me pidió disculpas porque iba a citar únicamente a escritoras de lenguas originarias, y le pregunté que por qué se disculpa si no hay problema, ¿no? Porque ella estaba tenía muy presente la cuestión de la separación de ambas cosas. Bueno,
So, Isaac wanted to go back a little bit to this idea of how he thinks the indigenous and the decolonial connect and refine it. So he explained that the way he sees it, decoloniality is inevitably linked to coloniality, right? And it's not an obvious statement. Basically, like before the arrival of coloniality, there is no such thing as the indigenous or the Indian or anything, right? There's the Maya people, their civilization and so on. And so it's only through the colonial period that kind of this decolonial struggle arises, and so therefore that equality gets problematized. But also in his experience in contemporary Maya, which is that historical one, people don't even, it's not just that you can't say indigenous means decolonial, but you can't even say Maya see themselves as indigenous. Most Maya, in fact, he says no one basically calls themselves indigenous. To the extent that
word doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in Maya, in the Maya language, the Yucatec Maya language. And so he even gave the example of there are these radio stations that are done by the nationally centralized Mexican Instituto Nacional Indigenista, and they had this campaign where they're trying to come up with an alternative of the word indígena, and they use the Nahuatl. The Nahuatl was one of the Aztec, languages, Macehual. They tried to say we're all Macehuales. And Mayans were very actively against it. They say, I am not a Macehual. So there's this kind of another complication. And then I think that was very briefly, but for the gender issue, he of course he wanted to point out that in the daily practice of gender equality, of course there's a lot of problems, etc. But we know the many reasons for that. But in Yucatec Mayan language, there actually is the lack of a distinction between male and female actually does pertain to the equality of gender, equivalence, but also equality, right? Igualdad, ¿no? Igualdad es la palabra. Sí. Y creo que eso fue todo, ¿sí? Did I miss something? Sí.
But if you want to respond, please.
Well, just to say thank you to Raúl for the question. Very nicely placed question. And I think it comes from a very basic conclusion, and is first that I started thanking for the community we are. That is also something that Catherine spoke about, this collective project. So when I started thanking the people that has opened this way for us to be here talking about this, it's just to recognize we are a small project. that has been built together. And that there is people, elders in this project, and I wanted to. So that's one thing, and the other thing is when we are speaking of relationality, it is about, for me, it is about having listened to the knowledge of indigenous and Afro-descendants. So like the work of Catherine that speaks of ancestrality and nature, like the work of Esterman, my own relations with the people in Chiapas, and it is through listening that I think these concepts come to. And I didn't spoke about listening as method, listening as critique. So I'm not using the concepts of modernity to criticize modernity. Here we are in the decolonial vocabulary, using the concepts of indigenous and Afro-descendants to criticize modernity and to bring it into our conversation of this little group that we are. Yeah, but always recognizing where it comes from, but always there is not time enough, but I think we always need to be transparent. This thinking of relationality is a very essential thinking in the Andean philosophies, in the Mayan philosophies, and that's where it comes from. And that's why it's such a powerful critique against the Western modernity way of functioning. So thank you for that question. En español muy rápido, decía que el concepto de relacionalidad, como lo estoy usando, no viene de una genealogía occidental, viene de haber escuchado el pensamiento indígena y afrodescendiente, a través del trabajo, por ejemplo, de Catherine Walsh, de Esterman, de Lenkers. Es como esa cuestión de relacionalidad, lo que estamos haciendo aquí es usarla ya como un vocabulario de la colonialidad, no un vocabulario de la modernidad colonialidad, para criticar y para ver lo que se está perdiendo, lo que es la resistencia. Y ahí conecta con tu pregunta, nunca ha desaparecido, es un pensamiento vivo. El problema es que la academia nunca lo ha escuchado. So this is about opening the academia to listen to that knowledge that it's not that modernity destroyed it completely. It's there and it is alive. Yeah? So obviously these are precisions that in such a short talk is very difficult to speak about. And obviously it's about relationality, is precisely not about centrisms, not about biocentrism or anthropocentrism. Relationality in the ontological question, it's a very long discussion, is not that there is the one at the beginning, like the Kantian or Hegelian, or the dialectical, not that there is the difference, like Derrida, that is also built on that, but the relation at the beginning. And this is the philosophy of the indigenous cultures from Aviala. Yeah? And it's a totally different system of thinking. Yeah. No traduje, pero estoy. No, pero estoy diciendo, ya no sé qué dije, pero. Bueno, ahí se los explico a los compañeros.
Pero terminaste traduciendo al inglés.
Sí, es que me olvida el inglés. Ya, solamente que la relacionalidad es precisamente no sobre centrismo, ni biocentrismo, ni antropocentrismo, sino es pensar al inicio en ontología relacional.
Gracias.